without further ado, Andrew Graham Dixon.
That's very kind of Hugo. I should say that I made inquiries, and I understand that the money that you've paid for your tickets doesn't go to Hugo's fantastic department of prints and drawings itself. It goes into the generality of the British Museum's coffers. So I would like to just let all of you know that the possibility also is there for you to become friends of the Department of Prints and Drawings, which doesn't have as big a budget for acquisitions as it jolly well should. So anybody who wants to become a friend and just donate a small amount or a large amount, even better, every month, do please think of doing it, because it makes such a difference to, I think, the department makes such a huge difference to the cultural life of Britain, and anything that can be done to keep it going, is admirable. As an art dealer said to Hugo just the other day, there's no such thing as a free Munch. We need money. Anyway, that's the end of my little, as it were, promo. Yes, I was going to talk about Munch. And perhaps talk a little bit about perhaps the Scandinavianness of Munch and how I see him, as it were, fitting into the European culture of his time, which I have to say is something that has, my perception of which has actually been shifted by the BM's current fascinating exhibition, in particular Julia's essay about his nature as a printmaker, in which she teases out all kinds of relationships between him and other contemporary printmakers, which, as well as historic printmakers, which hadn't occurred to me and which are extremely compelling, especially, for example, is the way in which he wonderfully plagiarizes Félicien Rops for his famous etching Puberty, and actually makes the Rops image much stronger in doing so. But I recommend the catalogue to the show. So, but first of all, I think the mystery of Munch, if you like, is how is it that a man from perhaps the least developed of all European countries, as the great tides of modernism swirl across the Western world, how is it that someone from the very edge, if you like, of modernity should have created perhaps its most enduringly popular image of, certainly its most enduringly popular image of alienation and of a certain way of being that we still seem instinctively to recognize as modern. The scream doesn't seem to grow old in a funny way. It seems still to express a certain type of hysteria that we feel confronted with our own urban experience. But to return to the picture itself, sorry, my notes are in a state of perfect chaos. There's a wonderful description of it by Munch himself, or the genesis of it. I was walking along the road with two friends. So it's a picture of not much. It's a picture of a man going for a walk along the fjord, just at the edge of Oslo. If you've been to Oslo, you know it's a city that immediately abuts Scandinavian wilderness or Scandinavian nature. So he's on the edge of the city and he's walking along this walkway next to a fjord. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun set. I felt a tinge of melancholy. Suddenly the sky became a bloody red. I stopped, leaned against the railing, dead tired, and I looked at the flaming clouds that hung like blood and a sword over the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on. I stood there trembling with fright, and I felt a loud, unending scream piercing all of nature. And there you have it. And it's such a... It's, in a sense, I think of it as it's a culminating image of the Romantic movement. Munch's great ambition is to paint the soul, to paint emotion, to paint human feeling, to give it a shape and a form, rather than to paint what he called pretty pictures for drawing rooms. Well, that ambition had actually already, to a great extent, been achieved, albeit reluctantly, by John Constable. painting is but another word for feeling, said John Constable in the early 19th century. And Constable's late, churning, desperate pictures, in which I think he's attempting to paint his continuing love of nature, but he's actually depicting his total alienation from the century that he now inhabits, his alienation from a world in which his wife is dead. Think of Hadley Castle, think of the sketch to Hadley Castle. Munch is in that same tradition. This is a picture in which nature worship, as I say, it's kind of gone mad. It's as if he's about to be eaten by nature. He's gone with his friends to experience nature. He can't experience it. He can't experience them. They've walked on. And suddenly, the hostility of the universe is engulfing him. Because we live in such an interconnected place, and because Edvard Munch is sort of a name to conjure with, and I think this is a very important part of his personality as an artist, both in his sense of separateness and his sense of Scandinavianness and his sense of a certain kind of dourness, let's say, but also in his absolutely avaricious interest in art when he does manage to get to see it. That he is more provincial than provincial can be. He's born in northeastern Norway. He's born in a population, he's born in a country, the entire population of which is probably half of Camden today. It's tiny, the population of Norway. There are no art schools. If you're lucky as he was, you might get to study with a painter who had learnt to paint, and he's perhaps in Oslo for you to study with. But you certainly have I hadn't realised this, though. I think, it's Julia's essay, that she points out that he had to go to Paris, he had to go to Berlin if he wanted to make prints, because there's nowhere else that they could make them for you, and certainly nowhere else that they could teach you how to do it. So he's in this immensely separate place, which is what Olaus Magnus's book presents Scandinavia as. It is the edge of the world. It is the frozen edge of the world. 2/3 of Norway, I think, or is it? Well, no, 1/3 of Norway is north of the Arctic Circle. This is the map that accompanied Olaus Magnus's book, and you can see that it didn't do a great deal for Scandinavian tourism. Freeze to death, and if you should happen to survive that process, you'll be eaten by a dragon. But that also fed a kind of interest which in turn feeds through, I think, very much so into Munch's work, that it becomes a place, because the romantic imagination is interested, and so is the imagination of whatever we call the period after Romanticism. The later 19th century imagination is fascinated by the idea of extremes, whether it's the idea of exploring emotional extremes or whether it's actually the idea of going to places that people have never been before, exploring wildernesses and wastelands, somehow getting away from this burgeoning, growing monster of industrialization and capitalism and cities. It's a sort of, people nowadays, of course, they're disappointed. They go to Everest and find that it looks a bit like a rubbish dump, and that's because 100,000 people go to Everest every year to try and climb it. In those days, you could still go to this wilderness. And there's a connection with the Gothic imagination. Mary Shelley sends Frankenstein off to die in the Arctic wastes. These extreme places, they become sort of tinged with a kind of allure. And Johan Christian Dahl, who is in a sense the father of Norwegian painting, he's one of several artists. Munch would be, in this terms of the people I'm talking about in this lecture, he'd be the last in the line, but there's more or less every Norwegian artist, if you look up their biography, they come from an astonishingly poor background. Petter Balker, another artist I'll look at in a minute, his family was so poor they had to make flour from tree bark. Dahl was very poor. He's, if I get his biography right, I think it's only a sort of a coalition of local merchants in his town who think that this boy's got talent. And if he's got talent, we'll send him, I can't remember where, I think it's Berlin. But Dahl ends up very much, as in a sense Munch does too, because of the nature of the Scandinavian art education system, or the lack of it, they end up going into the German orbit. And so Dahl very much becomes an artist in the circle of Caspar David Friedrich and Philipp Otto Runge, both of whom I think are probably artists very important to Munch. If you think of Munch's interest in solitary figures, in sublime landscapes, or indeed his interest in cycles like Runge's Times of the Day and so on, there's a very strong German influence on them. They're almost German by adoption. But Dahl is always, although he practices most of his career in Germany, he's very, very patriotically Norwegian. And so he paints things like the standing stones left by ancient peoples whose history we don't know, and says, this is my land. It's a land of harshness and extremes, but it's a land where you can really be at one with nature. This is, I suppose, his masterpiece in the National Museum in Oslo. It's probably his most cherished painting. It's a, you could certainly imagine that on the cover of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, if Wordsworth had been Norwegian. You've got the rainbow at the top, which is the symbol of God's covenant with man, and below you've got the Norwegian landscape. And it's an implicit rebuff, I think, this picture, to people living in London. Samuel Johnson, well, he says, if you're bored of London, you're bored of life. Well, a painting like this says, well, if London's the only way in which you can conceive life, you're not really touching God. Likewise, if you think Paris is your idea of high civilization, well, actually, we think this represents the ultimate good life. And it stands at the beginning of a tradition of paintings that have come to known in Scandinavia as the Norwegian nationalist school, which interestingly, as it develops, I haven't actually got any good examples of it, so I'll leave that one there. But there's a whole tradition of artists, basically to crudely oversimplify things. What begins to happen in Norway, and when it does start happening from about 1850 onwards, it happens with surprising and very disconcerting rapidity, is that all of those developments which we associate with modernity begin to arrive, but they arrive because this is a nation that has had no Renaissance, it's had no Enlightenment, it's had no scientific revolution, it's never really been part of the humanist republic of letters. It's a nation fundamentally of farmers, people involved with cattle, people involved with fishing, and a small merchant class who perhaps read books, but it's never had this sort of vibrant, thriving intelligentsia that other cultures in Europe have had. So when it begins to get all this stuff, it really gets it, and it's people are shocked. I think there's a statistic, again quoted in the Munch catalogue, that the population of Christiania, which was the 19th century name for Oslo, the population went from 17,000 in 1800 to 230,000 in 1901. And it's caused by, it's a little bit debatable as to what it's caused by, but it's caused by things like the advent of mechanized industry, but also, I think very significant, is that there's a massive increase in the 1870s and 1880s, again charted in one of the essays in the catalogue. There's a massive increase in American importation of grain to Europe. The cost of importing grain from America to Europe, thanks to the invention of the steam ship, plummets from 20 cents to 2 cents over a period of about 9 years, as a result of which whole swathes of European agriculture completely collapse, hence the disappearance of the Russian landed aristocracy, hence the massive impoverishment of even the English landed aristocracy, and hence massive poverty and displacement in Norway, where people can no longer live in small holdings like this because the money for their produce isn't there, so they're forced to go to the cities, new cities like Oslo. So this vision or dream of being part of nature, which is so strong for Dahl, within about 20 years, it's become a thing of the past. Peter Barcos is another interesting character. I mean, he's very much within the tradition, but I think he's an interesting character, partly because he's the most recent Scandinavian artist, Norwegian artist, to be acquired by the National Gallery. Very small, densely worked oil sketches. He's sort of, I suppose, the equivalent of Thomas Jones, a sort of Scandinavian version of Thomas Jones, but his subjects are the deep Arctic wastes. He paints the Northern Lights. He's the first artist to paint the Northern Lights. I don't know if I've got... And that's an example. That picture is probably about the size of a paperback book. But you see this tremendous sort of sense of natural wilderness and hostility. And it's a little bit moot as to who he thinks he's creating these images for, because they're not much sold in his lifetime. He's actually, interestingly, in Oslo, he's one of the first leftist trades union activists. So on the one hand, he's creating these pictures of an eternal Scandinavia, and on the other hand, he's recognizing the huge social problems implicit in the creation of a modern mass manufacturing workforce and trying to give them some means of negotiating with their potentially capitalistically exploitative employers. So he's a very interesting character. Adolf Tideman, no, he's not. He's called Lars Hartevig, and he's alive at the same time as Munch. He's painting in the late 19th century, but he's relatively short-lived. He's goes to Hamburg. He's basically illiterate. He's a peasant. He's made fun of by the other students. They break his heart with a girl who he's in love with. He thinks she's in love with him, and they all play along, and then they suddenly tell him, no, she doesn't give anything about you. And he basically goes mad and ends up in a loony bin in fact, Norway's first lunatic asylum for 8 years, and then just goes back to live on his parents' farm and paints these pictures in complete isolation for all his life. And they've only just really been rediscovered, and they're all now in the National Museum in Oslo, but they're rather amazing things. But Munch, and I think that's part of the power of the scream, it's as if all of that, he is bearing it all on his shoulders in one image, and he's got it all to say. And he's gone to France, he's seen Impressionism, he's been in Paris at the inception of the Impressionist movement. He's there in 1885, I think, 1886. So he knows what's going on. He's clearly aware of these currents of thought, these currents of feeling. They're present too in the writing of Ibsen. But I think it's part of the power of that image of the scream, that it's almost as if it's all been drawn in. So what is the scream? The scream could be alienation. The scream could be the sheer horror of the experience of which a lot of writers wrote about, which now is almost inconceivable to us. Writers wrote in the 19th century, before my experience was that each day I saw everybody, and everybody that I saw I knew. Now I'm in this thing called a city, and I might see 100 people in a row that I've never seen before. It's terrifying. And they're all, and this idea, there's some very interesting quotes from the work of Krafft Ebing in the catalogue to the Munch show, because I think that part of the argument of the show is indeed that these are factors behind what Munch is trying to do, what he's trying to say. There's a writer called Krafft Ebing who says, have you not thought about this? For example, traveling in a train, how fast your eye has to move all the time. Your brain is being taxed all the time. And then you go into a city, and it's natural because human beings are defensive creatures. You're constantly defending yourself. So you're in this state of high alert all the time. No wonder people drink booze. No wonder they take morphine or cocaine. No wonder they have coffee and they have tea and they smoke cigarettes, because it's a natural human response, because we're so overstimulated all the time. That's what we need to do this to calm ourselves down. And the thing is that for us, most people here, that's normal now. And you've even got this accelerating mechanism called a mobile phone, which if you do manage to have one moment of presence with yourself, so one moment of peace, half an hour on this effing train, you're then looking at dead people or your friends or Elvis Presley, who might be dead and your friend, and you are driving yourself mad. And I think that's why Munch's picture has endured so long, because he's depicting something in a shocking way that we need to be reminded that how we are living now is really quite shocking and probably pretty stupid. And he is shocked at that time by it. And so I took, again, I'm not really talking about the exhibition because I think the exhibition speaks for itself. I'm talking about what I think in terms of the background to who Munch is as an artist. So these are obviously paintings which aren't in the show, but the frieze of life, as he calls it, which is, it's interesting because it's what he's trying to depict are very fugitive. They're the sort of emotions that novelists try and snatch and catch at. They're not the emotions that can necessarily be easily sermonized or made universal. They're like a feeling, a tremor of anxiety, a feeling of jealousy, a pang of nerves, the sort of things that say Tolstoy writes about. And yet Munch, I think because he's from a Norwegian tradition and perhaps because he's used to certain, the town in which he was brought up is very Lutheran. Perhaps he's used to certain ways of creating. The frieze of life has always struck me rather as an attempt to impose a kind of old religious structure onto very, very subjective series of experiences undergone by Munch in the company of his three-quarters deranged bohemian friends. Who were forever having love affairs with each other, shagging the wrong person, shooting Munch in the finger, or shooting him, and he has to. I don't know what happened, or the story is, but or being one of his girlfriends? No, one of his friends was. Oh, she married about 9 people, as far as I can tell, and is finally in a footnote shot to death by a jealous lover in Tbilisi, of all places. So this is hardly the stuff of universal moral experience, and yet he is trying to sort of create in the frieze of life, and you can sort of get a sense of that in that museum. I can't remember the name of where it is. It's in that old Hanseatic town, anyway, the Munch Museum there. You get the sense of it there, where they've arranged them. He always wanted them all to be owned by one place and put in almost exhibited as if they were his own version of the Sistine Chapel. And it's a little bit like Wordsworth organising the extreme subjectivities of the Prelude into the same structure as Milton's Paradise Lost, as if by doing that it'll somehow become more solid. And it doesn't. It becomes less solid and even more fugitive. And I think the same is true with Munch. And when we look at images like that, Munch saw that beginning to happen in his time. He understood that alienation is something that happens when you start living in this modern way that we do even more and more and more and more. And I think that in a nutshell, that's why images like that or the Scream, I think they have lasted in a way that goes almost beyond whether you think they're good or bad as art. They're just very perceptive and they're very direct and they speak about something that's very visceral that we understand, that we still live through. People having breakdowns. If you ever work with people who have serious mental difficulties or a lot of those people, they look at a Munch painting like The Scream and there's nothing, they just say, yes, it's like that. It was like that. So I think maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.